Good afternoon. Welcome to the Edward J. Blaustein School of Planning and Public Policy. We're honored to co-sponsor this event with the Graduate School of Education. My colleague Drew Jodimer approached me about this opportunity for collaborating sometime last year. And I was so glad to be part of these lectures because I think that the Blaustein community can really build on learning more about education. And I know we have a strong interest in education inequality. I wanted to tell you all a little bit about Drew before I began. Drew joined the GSE faculty as the Rose and Nicholas DeMarzo Chair in Education. He is a member of the Learning and Teaching Department, and his overall research agenda examines the assessment and evaluation of teaching and related policy issues in teacher education. His body of work consists of examining constructs related to teacher quality, including the quality of classroom interactions, teacher knowledge and beliefs, and student achievement. Prior to coming to Rutgers, Drew was the Senior Vice President of Research at the Educational Testing Services in Princeton, where he led the Understanding Teaching Quality Center. While at ETS, he conducted research on assessments for students, all from the perspective of developing assessment methods that are directly related to instruction and learning. He's currently co-editing the AERA Handbook of Research on Teaching, and he was the co-editor of Educational Evaluation and Policy Analysis from 2006 to 2009. We're happy to have Drew here, and I welcome him to the platform.
Thank you, Stephanie. Good afternoon. It is my pleasure to welcome all of you here for the second annual Rose and Nicholas DeMarzo Lecture. And it's so nice to see friends of the GSE who've come to the talk today. I have the pleasure of holding the DeMarzo Chair, and it's established by Charles DeMarzo in honor of his parents to support scholarship in teaching and teacher quality. Before introducing our speaker, there are a few people I'd like to recognize. Of course, Stephanie and the Blaustein School of Planning and Public Policy have provided, once again, a wonderful venue for this lecture, and again, are gracious hosts for this event. I want to thank my associate, Colleen McDermott, who's organized this event, and so much more for the DeMarzo office. I also want to thank Jennifer St. Pierre and Jamie Can for providing excellent support in reaching out to the broader community of the GSE. I want to particularly thank our Dean, Richard DeLisi, for supporting the conference and all the work that my colleagues and I do at the GSE. Richard is stepping down from his position as leader of the GSE for over a decade. He has made an enormous impact during the time, and this lecture and the chair that was established under his leadership are part of the legacy he leaves to Rutgers and the GSE. Now to today's talk. I am very pleased to introduce our speaker, Sean Reardon. Sean is professor of education and of sociology at Stanford University. He received his doctorate from the Harvard Graduate School of Education, and then spent 5 years at Penn State before joining Stanford in 2004. Prior to Harvard, Sean taught physics, math, English, and photography in high schools in New Jersey and at the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation in South Dakota. Now, clearly, he developed substantial sociological chops and my utmost respect in his additional role as a school bus driver. Sean is simply one of the exceptional researchers in education. He brings outstanding and creative methodological approaches to explore some of the most pressing social issues of today. He not only helps us to understand the effects of social forces, such as segregation and student testing, but he also gives us new and insightful ways of thinking about these issues. Sean has received a multitude of honors for his work. He was recently elected to the National Academy of Education. He's been named a William T. Grant's Faculty Scholar and received the National Academy Spencer Foundation Postdoctoral Fellowship Award. He serves on the editorial board of many of the leading journals in the fields of educational research and policy. Today, I'm thrilled that Sean will share his work on income inequality and its relationship to educational inequality. Sean has been working on these issues for many years, and the fact that these issues have finally made it into current policy discussions makes this talk even more timely. It is my pleasure to present to you Sean Reardon.
Thank you, Drew, for that very nice introduction and for the invitation to be here. And and to the DeMarzo family for making this possible. I want to talk today. So let me start by saying this. I sort of think about the kind of work I do as something I like to call educational epidemiology. So just as in public health, there are epidemiologists whose job really is to sort of describe the landscape of health and disease, to figure out sort of where the problems are, where they started, how they spread, and when they are solved, as a way of helping to sort of diagnose them and lead towards remedies. So I sort of think of the kind of work I do in that same way, as sort of a broad descriptive kind of work that's essential to kind of good diagnosis and to sort of figuring out what the right solutions are. So what I'm not going to do today is tell you how to solve the problems I'm going to describe. Other smart people will have to figure that out. What I'm going to do, though, is sort of try to give you a sense of the national landscape of inequality, in the particularly inequality with respect to academic achievement by both race, ethnicity, and socioeconomic status. I'm going to show you both some sort of big national data over long 50-year trends. I'll show you some more recent data. And then I'm going to show you some new data that we've just started to explore that lets us kind of look at these patterns at a very kind of small geographic scale, much smaller than the kind of national or state scale that we usually see these things at. And I'm going to try to sort of suggest some of the reasons why the trends that have happened and why we see the sort of patterns we do, but I'm going to leave you disappointed because I'm not going to tell you how to solve them. So with that, so in a nutshell, this is the story I'm going to tell you about today. So what is this? This is a picture of the achievement gaps in both math and reading by both socioeconomic status, family income, and race. So we have black-white gaps in blue, Hispanic-white gaps in red, and income gaps. This is the gap between children whose families are at the 90th percentile of the income distribution and the 10th percentile of the income distribution. And on the x-axis here, we have year of children's birth. So this is going back to the 1940s. So two stories here should jump out at you. One is that the racial achievement gaps have declined over time. They declined a lot for kids born in the 50s, 60s, and into the 70s, but are still declining today, and actually in math are declining actually relatively rapidly today. In contrast, the socioeconomic gaps, the gaps between children from high and low income families, were much smaller back in the 50s and 60s than the racial gaps, and that pattern is reversed. Those gaps grew dramatically for kids born from, say, the mid-70s through the mid-90s. But you know, by the cohort born around 2000, we're almost twice as big as the racial gaps in reading, and pretty much the same in math. So for the rest of today, what I want to do is tell you in more detail about these patterns and then sort of suggest why that story has happened. In some ways, this is the story of the second half of the 20th century in America. This is the story of enormous racial inequality in the 50s and 60s that was reduced but not eliminated by a lot of social policies that were enacted in that period, and a story of low socioeconomic inequality in the 50s and 60s, historically low, that then has grown from the 70s, again, as a result of lots of social and economic policies and forces. So let's start with the racial disparities. So let me show you a few other just quick trends in racial disparities. So these are high school graduation rates. These are actual diplomas, not GEDs, by race for kids over a 40-year period of birth cohorts. And you can see that for a long time, graduation rates have basically been stagnant in the United States, but started to go up about a decade ago. So these are students born around 1980, graduating in 1998, so about 15 years ago, and graduation rates have gone up, but most of that increase is because Black and Hispanic graduation rates have gone up over that period. White graduation rates have gone up modestly, Black and Hispanics more, so this is this gap here is, 2/3 or half the size of what it was 15 years ago. That is not a trivial change. This is based on work that Dick Murnane did, published in Journal of Economic Literature. If you're interested in this, is not my work, but quite important. And in some ways, this mirrors what we see in the achievement gaps, which have been narrowing in the last 20 years. And so those, in some ways, are been playing out in high school graduation rates. When we look at college graduation rates, though, these are the proportion of 25 to 29-year-olds who have a bachelor's degree or more. That's been going up over time, of course, but it's been going up actually faster for whites than it has for blacks and Hispanics. We don't see the same narrowing that we saw for the high school graduation rates. Why? Well, one reason is we need to wait about 6 years before we see a high school graduation rate difference sort of turn into a college difference, for one thing. So we don't have as much time at the end of this chart. Remember, we saw it for the kids starting in 1980, but we don't have as many years with which to see it. And secondly, not everyone who graduates from high school goes on to college, and so this suggests there's some differential kind of attrition out of the education pipeline sometime between high school graduation and the bachelor's degree. This is another picture of college. This is college enrollment. So the way we did this is a little bit confusing, so let me talk you through it. We looked at students who were in 10th grade in 2002. So this is, for those of you who know this study, the Education Longitudinal Study. It's a nationally representative study of about 20,000 10th graders in 2002 from about 1,000 high schools across the country. They were followed up over time. This is based on data 6 years later. 8 years, I can't remember, sometime later, 6 or 8 years. When we looked to sort of see, well, how far had they gotten in their education? Had they graduated from high school? Had they enrolled in college? And if they had enrolled in college, what kind of a college? So down here, there's about 10 or 15% of them who didn't graduate from high school. There's another 15 or 20% who graduated from high school but never went to college. There's another 20 or 30% here who went to college but not a 4-year college. And then all of these went to 4-year colleges, and we've categorized them by their Barron's ranking. So Barron's categorizes schools by their selectivity, with a 1 being the most selective. There are about 80 or 90 number 1 Barron's colleges in the country. That includes the Ivy League colleges, the flagship state universities, the elite liberal arts schools, the Williams and the Swarthmores and this sort of stuff. So these are the most selective schools. The 2s are kind of also selective, but not quite in that tier. So this encompasses about maybe 200 or 300 colleges in the country. And then what we've shown here is the racial composition of sort of each of these categories, right? And so you can see that Black and Hispanic students are way overrepresented in the no diploma, no college, or just community college categories, and way underrepresented in the selective colleges and universities. This is about, this is what it should be. It should be about 15% Black. It's about 4 to 5% Black, I think, overall in all of those colleges. A little bit more so Black and Hispanic in the very top ones, partly because those schools compete for the best minority students. They can offer much more financial aid, and possibly also because some of them use affirmative action policies. So the net result of all of those things, though, does not produce a very large number of minority students in those most selective colleges. So even though there's some progress in high school graduation rates, we're not seeing enormous progress in 4-year degree rates, and we still have a big problem with the composition of the most selective schools. So now let's look at achievement gaps. So now I want to show you sort of achievement gaps at different levels of geography below the national level. So what we've done here is we've looked at data from the last 20 years, both from NAEP and from state accountability tests, and we've sort of computed the sort of average achievement gap in each state over this time period and ranked them. So on the bottom axis here is the size of the achievement gap measured in standard deviation units. So 0 is no gap, 1 is a gap of 1 standard deviation. On average, the Black, white, and Hispanic white gaps are around 0.6 to 0.75 standard deviations. But you can see there's enormous variation across the states. So New Jersey I've circled here since we're in New Jersey, just for the local flavor. New Jersey's at the high end of the achievement gaps, both the black-white gaps and the Hispanic-white gaps, with black-white gaps of around 1 standard deviation and Hispanic-white gaps of around 0.8 standard deviation. So, but, there are some states, and typically states with few minorities, who have relatively small gaps: West Virginia, Vermont, Kentucky, Maine, Idaho, North Dakota. So they're doing great, but there aren't many minority students there, so that's not so great. This is the same thing, but now we've estimated the trend across time in each state. So how is the achievement gap changing in each state across time? Well, 0 would mean it's basically been flat. So you can see the black-white gap on average is going down a little bit because most of the states are to the left of that line. But in some states, the gaps are getting bigger. And in some states, the gaps are getting smaller relatively rapidly. A change of 0.02 standard deviations, that's per year. So multiply that by 20 years that this is over. That's a decline of about 0.4 standard deviations. That's about half of what the gap was on average in states in 1990. So that's a sizable change in states, in a few states. But then on the other hand, we've got states that are increasing as well. So on average, the gaps are changing modestly over time in the right direction, but there's a lot of heterogeneity across the states. And so that suggests we might learn something about why are the gaps changing more in one place or another to help us understand what might be the causes of it and ultimately what might be the remedies for it. So now we're going to go even below the state level, and I'm going to look at metropolitan areas. So what we've done is we've looked at test scores for all the schools within a given metropolitan area and computed a kind of metropolitan area achievement gap for every metropolitan area in the country, or most of them. There's a few we can't do it for. And we're looking at how big is the achievement gap within a metropolitan area. So you can see, again, lots of variation across the metropolitan areas. Some metros have gaps 0.6 standard deviations or so. Some more than 1 standard deviation. This is the Edison, New Brunswick metropolitan area, where I believe we are currently located. So kind of on the middle range of achievement gaps among the metropolitan areas with the largest black student populations, but lots of variation. Some of the places that have the biggest ones are either in the metropolitan areas in the south or the kind of Rust Belt, Midwestern kind of metropolitan areas with large racial inequalities. When we look at the Hispanic-white achievement gaps across metropolitan areas, you see maybe even more variation. Now, all of these metropolitan areas are pretty much in California, Texas, or Florida, with the exception of a few, because I've shown here the metros with the most Hispanic students. Here's Edison, New Brunswick, though it does make the top 50, and it's right smack in the middle of those. Most of the ones down here are from the coastal parts of California, so the San Francisco metro, San Jose, Oakland, Santa Barbara, Santa Ana, Oxnard, LA, San Diego. What do all those places have in common? They're all on the coast of California. Up here are the California ones that are from the Central Valley, so Fresno and Modesto and places like that. So why would the gaps be smaller in the Central Valley of California than the coast? Because the coast has a very affluent white population, whereas the Central Valley does not. So it's not necessarily the gaps are bigger because these places are sort of doing better educationally. It may be just the gaps are bigger in these metropolitan areas because of differences in the socio-demographic differences between the populations. And so that's a thing we'll look at next. So another thing to sort of point out about these achievement gaps is that a small gap might arise because there's something that's producing equity, something that's bringing up the test scores of the low-performing group and they're doing well. But it also might arise because the high-performing group is not doing very well at all. And so a small gap doesn't necessarily mean a great educational success story. A small gap might mean a profound failure on all fronts, right? And the other reasons why these gaps may differ, as I just mentioned, is because of partly they may be due to socioeconomic differences between the groups, and those differences vary across places. So let's look at that now. So here's, this is white, black, and white Hispanic gaps. Each dot is a metropolitan area. And on the x-axis here is the size of the income difference between the average black family and the average white family in the metropolitan area who has school-age children. And these are scaled in a metric that's comparable to the gaps, so it's sort of a standard deviation metric. And what you can see is there's a strong positive relationship. Metropolitan areas where the white-black differences in income are big, the achievement gaps tend to be big. And in places where those income differences are small, the achievement gaps are small. But notice, even when the income differences are zero, the achievement gaps are not zero. It's not like the income gap explains all of the achievement gap, because even in the few places where we have very small or zero income gaps, we don't see zero racial gaps. But the strong association suggests that economic differences between the groups matter a lot. This is the same sort of picture, but now on here is a measure of the parental education gap between the two groups. So this is a measure of the difference in average years of education between the families, the parents of white and black children in school. And again, we see this strong positive relationship. Places where white and black children have parents with larger differences in education levels tend to have larger gaps. But again, it's not zero, even in the places where those gaps are very small. Now, those gaps could be small because the white population has low levels of education, which is sort of the Central Valley, California story, or they could be smaller because blacks or Hispanics have high levels of education. But in either case, we're not seeing these gaps go to zero. Another possibility might be segregation. So some metropolitan areas are enormously segregated, both residentially and within schools. And if that leads to very differences in educational experiences and school quality, we might expect more segregated places to have larger achievement gaps. So now on the x-axis, I'm showing you the between-school measure of segregation in metropolitan areas, with zero meaning no segregation. All black and white students go to the same schools, basically, and one being sort of total segregation. So some places are quite segregated. 0.5, 0.6 are very high measures of segregation on these metrics. And those places tend to have bigger gaps than places that are less segregated. Now, that's not to say these are causal relationships, that if we reduce segregation and left everything else the same, the gaps would get smaller. We don't know from this, because one reason why there's segregation is because there's big income differences between blacks and whites, and so they can afford to live in different school districts, and then therefore their kids attend different schools. So it's not clear whether we should think of this as somehow due to segregation, or maybe due to income and other things that produce segregation, or maybe some combination of those. But it does suggest that there are big forces sort of outside the control of any individual school or any individual classroom that play a role in producing these achievement gaps that aren't sort of within school, but none of them seem to sort of, on their own account for it. Now, I won't show you, but we've done some sort of regression analysis when we sort of put a bunch of things in the model and see how much of the variation in achievement gaps we can explain. And we can explain somewhere on the order of 40 to 60% of the variance in achievement gaps using things like this: socioeconomic differences between the groups, segregation levels, and that sort of thing. But there's still a lot of variation left over that's not accounted for. And it seems to me that that suggests there really are features of the schooling system and features of what goes on in schools that may play an important role in exacerbating the achievement gaps, even though schools can't be sort of held entirely accountable for them. Now, the other thing we've done is we actually can go down and we can measure achievement gaps at the district level. There are 16,000 school districts in the United States. We can only compute achievement gaps for about 1/5 of those, about 2,500, because most districts don't have enough black students or Hispanic students or white students perhaps, they don't have enough of two groups in order to measure the achievement gaps, either because the districts are small and rural or because their schools are highly segregated. But these are the 50 districts with the largest black student populations in the country, and these are the achievement gaps. You can see they're less precisely estimated. We have big error bars on them. Newark is the closest city to here that shows up on this list, so I thought I'd show you that. So Newark is sort of high to middle range of this. The ones with the biggest gaps are Wake County, Memphis, Tennessee, Charlotte, Mecklenburg, Washington, D.C., Charleston, South Carolina. So a lot of the southern, big southern districts show up down here. I won't say any more about that. When we look at the Hispanic white gaps, the nearest district with lots of Hispanic students is New York City. It shows up here. And again, most of these, of course, are from California, Texas, and Florida. We see a lot of the, like Austin, San Diego, Houston, PG County, LA Unified, Montgomery County, places where you have very higher income, highly educated white populations and a lower income black population tend to be the places with the biggest Hispanic population. No, these are Hispanic, tend to be the places with the bigger gaps. So we can look at the same sort of pictures and say, does the same patterns we saw at the metro level sort of reproduce themselves at the district level? So now we can say, what's the black-white difference in income within a school district, and how does that relate to the black-white achievement gap? And you see a remarkably similar picture. Again, strong positive relationship, but even when that income difference is near zero, it doesn't eliminate the achievement gap. This is the parents' education gap. Again, same picture, same story. Strong positive relationship, but doesn't explain all of the gap. And then this is the segregation within these school districts. And again, positive relationship, but doesn't come anywhere near sort of explaining all of the gap. So we could, again, if we put in lots of things in the model and try to explain it, we end up explaining somewhat less. In this case, somewhere like, I think, 30 to 50% maybe of the variance in the district level gaps. So there's a lot left to explain, a lot that might be due to things the district are doing, how districts are allocating resources among schools, quality of teachers, school facilities, tracking, any number of things you might think about that happen within a district that might provide unequal opportunities for kids. But another possibility is that the gaps are sort of there when kids get to school, and the schools might be treating the kids equally in some sense, but not supra equally enough to sort of reverse the gaps. So this is another picture of the long-term trend in the achievement gap. So this is the curve I showed you before for the black-white gap in math and reading. And then these are the black-white gaps in math and reading from other data sources. So this solid line is from the long-term NAEP, which has been the same test for 40 years and is useful for looking at long-term trends. But if we look at the main NAEP tests or the state NAEP tests, or we look at state accountability tests from the sort of NCLB style state tests, all of them basically show that for the last 15 or 20 years, the black-white achievement gap has been going down. So that finding is robust depending across different measures. This line down here, however, is the size of the gap when kids enter kindergarten. So this is from 3 nationally representative studies of kindergartners, one done in fall of '98, one done in '06, '07, and one done in fall of 2010. So these are school readiness tests in math and reading given to kindergartners, 20,000 kindergartners or so in each case. And so we measure the achievement gap from them. And what you see here is that the black-white achievement gap in school readiness, at the time kids enter kindergarten, has been going down at about the same rate as the black-white gap. These are all measured in 4th to 8th grade. So the gap's been declining at kindergarten entry at about the same rate as it's been declining when we look at the sort of 4th through 8th grade data. Now you might have thought, well, maybe the 4th to 8th grade gaps are going down because between kindergarten and 4th grade, the schools are sort of doing something to reduce it. But what it looks like here is that it's been something that's been causing it to go down before kids get to kindergarten. And schools are kind of maintaining, the gap is growing the same amount from kindergarten to fourth grade as it has been over the last 12 or 15 years. So this suggests we can't attribute the narrowing of the gap to something that's been happening in schools. It might be more something that's been happening in early childhood. Another thing you might think is maybe this has to do with NCLB, because NCLB aimed in part to narrow racial achievement gaps. That's explicitly written in the legislation. That's why it has subgroup-specific test score reporting and subgroup-specific accountability. So these are the years when these dashed lines are when NCLB was implemented. So the kids who were born in whatever year this was, 88 or so, would have kind of just been finishing 8th grade in 2002 when NCLB was starting. So this cohort here kind of wouldn't have any NCLB exposure. And then this dashed line is kids who were born in the late 90s, and so they spent all of their K-12 years or K-8 years under NCLB. And these cohorts in the middle are kind of the ones who had some years when the NCLB was in effect and some not. So if you thought that this was going down because of NCLB, you might expect that it should have sort of started when NCLB started, but it looks kind of like it's been going down more than that. It's a little hard to tell because most of these data don't really start early enough for us to really disentangle it. But we did another study where we said, how would NCLB narrow the achievement gaps? Well, one way to think about what it might do is take Vermont and Louisiana. NCLB says you have to report the test scores of all students in your school broken down by subgroup, as long as there's enough students of that subgroup to yield a statistically reliable answer. The laws of statistics are different in different states, so in some states it only takes 30 students to get a statistically reliable answer. In California it takes 100. It's very imprecise in California. But in many states it's 30 or 40 students. So if you have a school with fewer than 30 or 40 black students in a grade, or you don't have to, or in the grades 3 to 8, you don't have to report scores by that subgroup. So consider Vermont. Vermont has very few black students. They're not very segregated. And as a result, there's almost no black students in Vermont who are in a school where there's enough of them to have their scores reported. I think literally there might be zero. I think it might be true that no Vermont school reports scores separately for black students. So there's no pressure, in some sense, in Vermont under NCLB to affect the test scores of black students because they're not reported separately. Now take Louisiana. Louisiana has a large black population. They're very segregated, and so as a result, almost every black student in Louisiana is in a school where their scores get reported. And so if schools respond to this sort of reporting pressure, there should be more pressure in Louisiana to raise the improvement of black students relative to whites than there is in Vermont. And so what we did was we looked to sort of see how much achievement gaps started to narrow after NCLB started in each state. And we saw how that correlated with this measure of how many black students were in schools where there was enough of them to be reported. So on this axis, this is our measure of how much achievement gaps started to narrow once NCLB started. On average, it's about 0. Most states, the trend kind of continues once NCLB started, but doesn't really change. But here's Vermont. We also have Montana and Idaho over here, where there's basically no black students who are in a school where their scores get reported. Here's Louisiana, 90-something% of their black students are in schools where their scores get reported. And you can see there's this negative relationship, which is the way we expect. That is, in the states that have more black students whose scores are reported, the black-white achievement gap starts to narrow more after NCLB starts than in the states where there's less. In fact, the achievement gap starts to widen in Vermont, Montana, and Idaho after NCLB starts. Maybe because they're paying more attention to the white students because that's whose scores count. Because white student scores get counted twice in Vermont. You have to report the total scores and then you have to report subgroups that are countable, so the white student scores get reported twice. The black student scores get reported once because they're in the total, but not by subgroup. All of which to say is this suggests maybe NCLB had a little bit more effect on achievement gaps in some of these states, but on average it had no real effect. And so coupled with the fact that we see this gap narrowing in kindergarten, it suggests that NCLB isn't probably the story why black-white achievement gaps have been narrowing over the last 15 or 20 years of cohorts. I think all of this should suggest two things to you. One is socioeconomic differences, things that happen outside of school, are a powerful factor in shaping the size of achievement gaps, but they're not the whole story. And that some of the trend that's been happening, or much of it, may be attributable to things that have been happening before kindergarten entry. But we don't really know whether or not things that schools have been doing are playing a role, or whether or not which things that schools are doing play a role in explaining the rest of the achievement gaps that we can't explain from the socioeconomic differences and whatnot. So I'm going to stop here on the racial achievement gaps, and now I'm going to turn to the socioeconomic achievement gaps. So you remember the other story here that I showed you at the beginning is that while the racial gaps have been declining, the socioeconomic gaps in achievement have been widening rather dramatically. So let me just tell you a few sort of stylized facts about this. So one thing is the picture of income inequality. So this is from Thomas Piketty and Emmanuel Saez's work. So they measure, going back to 1913 or something, the proportion of all income earned in the United States that accrues to the top 10% of earners. So this is one relatively simple way to characterize income inequality. Income inequality was very high in the 20s and 30s. The top 10% of earners earned about 45% of all income. It declined dramatically with World War II because of big changes in the economy, price controls, wage controls, a whole bunch of things happen. And then income inequality stays really low for a long time. So the 50s and 60s and even into the 70s are the era of low income inequality in the United States, sort of historically low. And then starting in the 70s, income inequality sort of takes off. It dips at the recession because people with lots of money in the stock market and investments lose a bunch of money, but they quickly make it back and more. The rich recover well from the recovery. The middle class and the working class and the poor do not so much. So income inequality now is at an all-time high. The top 10% earn about 50% of all the income in the United States. So this coincides in some ways with the timing of the story that I showed you earlier. This is that picture again. So the achievement gap starts to widen for cohorts born, I don't know if you can see this, but around the mid-70s, I think, is when these lines start to go up. So that looks kind of like the timing of income inequality, but the connection of income inequality to income achievement gaps is not straightforward. So we'll think a little bit more about why that might be the case. Now, another thing to keep in mind is that most of the growth in the income achievement gap is at the high end of the income distribution. So this is the growth, this is the reading income achievement gap. This is just the same thing as before, but stretched out, so it's really wide. And if we look at, instead of looking at the gap between the 90th and the 10th percentile child, we break it down into the gap between the 90th percentile and the median income child and the median and the bottom. The blue here is the gap between the child whose family is middle class and poor, and that was pretty big in 1950, and it's about the same size now. Not substantial change over this long period. The gap between the rich and the middle class, that's the child from the high income and the child from the middle income family, wasn't very big back in the 50s and 60s, but it's where all the growth has happened. This gap now is as big as this gap now, and maybe 2 or 3 times bigger than it was back then. So the reason why the income achievement gap grew over this time period doesn't appear to be because the sort of test scores of the bottom fell away from the middle, or the middle and the top sort of pulled away from the bottom. It's that the top pulled away from the middle. And so this is really a story of kind of upper tail inequality, not lower tail inequality. And I think this is sort of challenge is the way we often think about inequality in the United States, which is we often think about inequality as a problem about the poor not doing well relative to the middle class. And lots of social policies, lots of educational policies targeted at reducing one kind of inequality or another are aimed at kind of bringing up the bottom and kind of reducing the gap between the bottom and the middle, reducing poverty, Title I and various sort of strategies aimed at low-income schools to sort of bring up the bottom. But this suggests that we still need to do that. That gap is still big, but that the place where all the action has been happening has been at the top. And so we need a sort of a different kind of explanation and probably different kinds of policies to sort of think about what you do about that. If we also look at other outcomes, educational outcomes by income. So Robert Putnam has some very interesting work where he looks at non-test score kinds of outcomes by socioeconomic background. So he looks at how many extracurriculars kids are participating in. Are they taking leadership roles in extracurriculars? Are they involved in sports? Do they participate in student government? Do they volunteer? So lots of the kind of pro-social things we would like young people to do that aren't about test scores. When he looks at those kinds of outcomes from the 70s to today, he finds a very similar pattern to this pattern of the income achievement gap, which is that the gap between children from higher and lower socioeconomic status families has grown over this time period, and it looks in some of his data as if it's mostly grown kind of at the top end. So this gap is growing not just in test scores, but in other kinds of outcomes that one would like for young people. Another one is college enrollment. So this is from Sue Donarski and Martha Bailey's work. And they look at kids born in the early 60s, and 36% of those born in the top quartile of income families graduated from college, and 5% in the bottom did. The low-income families have increased only modestly their rate of college completion over this time period, but high-income families have increased it substantially. So there's a much bigger gap, at least measured in percentage points, in college completion by family background. We can also see a similar story here. So this is not your probability of completing college, but it's your probability of attending one of these highly selective colleges. So I think this is probability of attending one of those Barron's 1 or 2 colleges, those very selective ones, by your family income. So this is the high school class of 1982. If you were sort of anywhere below the 75th percentile or so, you had less than a 5% chance of going to one of those colleges. But if you were in the top decile or so, you had a 10 or 15% chance. So there's not only a gradient by income, but it's very pronounced at the high end. So the difference between the top and the middle is much bigger than the difference between the middle and the bottom. That's the class of 82. When we look at the class of 92 and the class of 2004, you can see that your probability of going to one of those colleges doesn't change much if you're in the bottom half of the income distribution. But it changes a lot if you're in the top part of the income distribution. So again, we're seeing sort of a pulling away of the top on different kinds of educational outcomes, not so much a growing disparity between the middle and the bottom. And then this is that same type of picture I showed you before, but now I'm shading it by income rather than by race. And you can see again, students from low-income families are way disproportionately represented down here and way underrepresented in the selective colleges. Over half, actually, I think about 60% of the students in these most selective colleges come from families in the top quintile of the income distribution. And less than 10% come from the bottom quintile. So very, very skewed distribution by income in terms of who goes to which colleges. All right. Now, another thing to keep in mind is that these gaps don't change much as children progress through school. So this is data from a longitudinal study, the early childhood longitudinal study, which followed a group of kindergartners in 1998 and tested them in math and reading 7 times by the time they got to 8th grade. And so each of these dots is a period in which they were tested. And this is the achievement gap, the average difference in test scores between kids from the 90th and 10th percentile of the income distribution. And what you can see is the gap is just about as big when they enter kindergarten as it is when they're in 8th grade. Increases maybe by 10% over that whole time period. And in fact, it goes down during the school years, at least in these 2 years when we have fall and spring measures, and widens again in the summer. So this suggests that it's not schools that are producing the gap. They actually seem to be reducing it slightly when kids are in school, but it's out of school time, either before they get to kindergarten or in the summer when the gaps are widening. So that suggests maybe schools can be part of the solution, but schools and unequal school quality for low and high income kids isn't what's making the gap as big as it is. I mean, schools could be more equal than they are. They're not equal enough to overcome this inequality, but they're not, in some sense, the primary cause, because these gaps are huge in kindergarten. In fact, in this other study that has similar school readiness tests at age 4, the gap's already the same size at age 4 as it is when kids enter kindergarten. And so that suggests that early childhood is sort of a crucial period for understanding the gaps, both the income gaps here, but also the racial gaps, as I showed you before, because that seemed to be where the action is happening over the last 10 or 15 years. Now, some people always say, well, are the gaps going up because the top is doing better or because the bottom and the middle are doing worse? What's going on? So if we look at test scores over the long term, and so these are basically NAEP long-term trend scores, but I rescaled them so they have kind of an SAT-like scale, because some audiences don't know what the NAEP scale is, because it's just a made-up scale, which, frankly, the SAT scale is made up too, but at least a lot of people are familiar with it. So 500 here is average, and 100 points is a standard deviation. And so if we looked at 13-year-olds' math scores in 1978, low-income students were scoring about a half standard deviation below middle-income students, and middle-income students were scoring about a half standard deviation behind high-income students. That gap widened, but everyone was going up. The test scores of the poor kids went up, as well as the test scores of the middle class and the rich. It's just that the test scores of the rich went up a lot faster than the test scores of the poor. So it's not that the sort of bottom is falling out of the distribution, or the bottom and the middle are falling out. Everyone's going up. The test scores of the children of the rich are going up faster. And just for comparison, I thought I'd put the race trends on here too. So this is now, these are the white students' average test scores, Hispanic students' average test scores, and black students' average test scores. And one of the remarkable stories, which I think everyone should feel happy about, is that in 1978, black students were scoring 1 1/4 standard deviations below white students. And the average black student had test scores a half standard deviation below the average student who was at the 10th percentile of the income distribution. So that means to be black was a lot worse than to be really poor, in some sense. Black and Hispanic students' scores went up dramatically over this time period. The average black and Hispanic students' have scores now that are almost the same as the average white students were in 1978, which means they've gone up over a standard deviation over that time period. That's several grades worth of improvement. And white student scores have gone up, but not as much, so these racial gaps are smaller. So if we're looking at the sort of the race story as well, the reason why the race gaps have narrowed again is because of the steep progress of black and Hispanic students, and the progress, but not as steep progress, of the white students. So everyone's going up. Schools aren't getting worse. The educational system's not falling apart, despite what you read. Everyone's doing better. The average 13-year-old now has test scores that are about the same, about the same as the average 14-and-a-half-year-old might have had in the 1970s. So, 1.5 to 2 years of improvement, kind of, if you do some crude back-of-the-envelope sort of calculations with the NAEP stuff. So kids are doing better than their parents' generation were on these tests. Maybe the economy requires even more than that. Maybe everyone else around the world is growing even faster, and that's why everyone's anxious. But it's not fair to say that the sort of schools have gone downhill in some sense. They just maybe haven't gone uphill as fast as people would like. So why has this all happened? So here's my kind of very short version of the story of what I think this and other evidence suggests. So a number of things happened. So if you were born in the 1960s, your parents were probably better off than their parents were, because the economy was growing at a very rapid rate, and so everyone was sort of doing better than the prior generation. So your parents are feeling pretty secure, whether you're kind of working class or whether you're middle class or whether you're upper income, you're probably sort of doing better than your parents' generation were. They were growing up in the Depression, and the economy's growing 3% a year, and everyone's happy. It's the beautiful 60s. I don't know. Okay, maybe not everyone's happy. There's a lot of problems, but economically, the country's growing and most people are better off than their parents' generation. And your education didn't matter that much because you could earn a very solid middle-class wage working in manufacturing with just a high school diploma. And so your parents might not have been very anxious about your education, A, because everything seemed to be getting better, so why wouldn't it keep getting better? And B, even if you didn't do so well in school, you could get a good job and be fine. So then the economy kind of tanks in the 1970s. There's inflation, stagnation, other things go on. And manufacturing declines, unions start to decline, the returns to a college degree grow rapidly over the period from the 70s through 2000, and it gets increasingly important to have a college degree in order to be middle class, in order to sort of earn a middle class wage. The economy kind of bifurcates into a lot of low wage, low skill kind of service sector jobs and high wage, high skill kind of information economy types of jobs that require a college degree. And so a college degree over this time period gradually gets more important, and your parents probably get more anxious about how well you're doing in school because A, they know it matters more, and B, not everyone's doing better anymore, and so there's a lot of energy focused on education as a result. So this changes how parents think about what it is to be a parent and what they're supposed to do with their children, so they invest more in their children's education. It also changes how people think about schools. So if you went back 40 years, you wouldn't hear a lot of people talking about test scores as the way to measure whether or not kids were doing well in schools. Test scores were used, but they certainly weren't the thing, right? They weren't the way you measured whether a teacher was good. They weren't the sole way you measured whether a kid was good. They weren't certainly a way you measured whether a school was good. There were lots of other goals people had for schooling, but because of the increased importance of education and the role of tests as sort of gatekeepers, we start to think of schools as being about test scores, and so it sort of changes kind of, I think, the national zeitgeist about what you think education is supposed to be. And so we get this increased focus on kind of academic measures of success as measured by test scores, and less focus on things like creativity and cooperation and citizenship and other kind of, fuzzy 1970s kinds of notions about what schooling should be, which seem like quite useful things. Back in the 70s, NAEP used to test kids not just on math and reading, but it also used to test them on cooperative problem solving and moral reasoning. So NAEP used to give kids questions that said things like, you're walking through a park and you see a sign that says no Negroes are allowed. What do you do? How do you respond to this? How do you think about this, right? That is not the kind of question that's on NAEP right now. NAEP used to send people into schools and they would sit kids down at a table and give them a problem and say, solve it together. And then the assessor would watch them try to solve the problem together and score them not on whether they got it right or wrong, but score them on how well they worked together to solve a problem. Because NAEP was supposed to sort of measure lots of things the educational system was doing. In the 1980s, the Reagan administration cut lots of the funding for NAEP, and those were the kinds of things that got cut, and NAEP became largely a kind of academic, math, reading, and now science and other kinds of academic kinds of things, but all the kind of other goals of schooling that were sort of embodied in those early NAEP assessments, you don't see them anymore. We've really changed what we think schooling is supposed to do, and you see that. So all of this means there's this kind of increased competition for educational advantage. if education sort of matters more than it used to, and test scores are the measure of educational success, and parents are anxious about their children's futures in ways they might not have been 20, 30 years before, they're going to invest lots of their energy in trying to make sure their kids do well in school, and by that they mean do well on standardized tests. And anytime you sort of ratchet up a competition, it's really useful if you have a lot of money in your pocket, because money is helpful in a competition. And so it's not just, I think, that income inequality has grown. It's not just that the rich have more money than they used to have relative to the poor. It's that money has gotten more important and more consequential, and not just money, but the kinds of sort of social resources that high income, highly educated parents sort of have at their disposal have gotten more important in children's success. So there's a couple of other just ways to sort of point out some features of this. So this is from a study that Julia Wrigley did back in the late 80s, and I wish somebody would redo it with more recent data. But what she did was she, and frankly her army of graduate students, I suspect, read thousands of articles from magazines from 1900 to 1985. And these were magazines that were aimed at mothers. So they would be the equivalent of Parenting Magazine or Mothering Magazine or Ladies' Home Journal or Good Housekeeping or whatever they would have been at different eras. But these were the kinds of magazines that mothers would read, now mostly middle-class mothers probably, or and they looked for articles in these magazines in which experts gave advice to mothers, particularly mothers of infants, about what to do with this young child you have. What are you supposed to do with an infant? Useful thing for parents to think about. Certainly, mothers aren't the only ones who should think about what to do with their infants, but historically, the mother was more the one whose role that was, and so they looked specifically for this. And what they did was they categorized the kind of advice that experts gave to mothers into 5 categories. Nutrition and medical advice were 2 of the categories, and you see those were sort of the dominant categories in the first third of the century or so. Basically, keep your kid alive, which is not unreasonable. Infant mortality was non-trivial back then. I mean, frankly, infant mortality in the U.S. is still higher than in any other developed country, but it's much lower in the U.S. now than it was back then. So it was a good idea to get some medical advice and keep your kid alive, also figure out what to feed them. That's always useful advice for parents to know. But it also suggests a sort of way of thinking about a child as a physical being, right? The child is a body who needs to be fed and kept alive. Contrast that with the sort of latter period here, where the dominant things are about intellectual stimulation and socio-emotional development. Those inherently sort of conceive of the child as a cognitive, emotional being, much less so than a physical being. Now, there's, of course, it's not like they weren't getting any medical or nutrition advice, but still a lot of it was this. Now, there was also this sort of fresh air period, which there's no more fresh air, so that's, but actually back here she shows examples of magazines giving parents advice not to stimulate your child. They would say things like, the child is really a vegetable and best kept in a kind of sleeping state. Children should sleep for 20 to 22 hours a day. They shouldn't be overly stimulated. It's not good for them. Whereas now it's all about stimulate your child, play them music when they're in utero and don't stop, keep them going with all kinds of, get the right colors in the room and get the right things that make the sounds, and you got to keep them stimulated, which is sort of exactly the opposite of what the evidence is. So why am I telling you this? Because I think it suggests a sort of long-term historical trend that accelerated in this more recent period to thinking of children as these sort of cognitive, emotional beings, where what your job as a parent is to think about their brain, not to think so much about their physical body. And if you're thinking a lot about their brain, you're going to do a lot more sort of cognitive development sort of work. And if this kind of work was done more, as Annette Leroux says, by higher income moms than by working class moms, for example. So if these ideas about the child as a kind of cognitive being who needs to be stimulated sort of take hold more among the middle and upper class, then that could drive some of these changes in what we see in sort of cognitive outcomes. That is, there's a greater investment in early childhood, greater investment in cognitive development, but more so among the higher income, highly educated families than the working class families, and therefore maybe that's why we see this sort of growing trend. Another piece of evidence on this comes from consumer expenditure surveys. So this is work by Greg Duncan and Dick Murnane, and there's also some nice work on this stuff by Sabino Kornrich and Frank Furstenberg, where they look at consumer expenditure surveys. So every year, I think the government gives these surveys and asks people, what are you spending your money on? And so they look in particular at families with children and look at how much money they spend on things related to their children. And so there's things like how much do you spend on education, on childcare, on enrichment activities. There's a category called accessories, which I guess is purses and handbags or something. I don't know what it is. Anyway, but what you can see is when they look at sort of enrichment expenditures on children, low-income families have increased their spending by about 40 or 50% over this time period, I guess. But high-income families have increased their spending by about 2.5 times over this time period. Now, they have more money to spend, so it's not necessarily that they're spending a bigger share of their income, but they're spending a lot more money. Now, it's not that the money necessarily buys cognitive development, but it's sort of an indicator of a greater kind of focused investment on children. If you look at time use surveys over this same 40-year period, the parents of all classes report spending more time with their children than they did in the 1970s. But the rate at which the amount of time spent with children has gone up twice as fast for highly educated parents as it is for less educated parents. So again, you see this greater investment in time, greater investment in money in children, more so for the high income families than for the lower income families. And so all of this suggests that this sort of story I'm trying to tell you about changes in kind of parental investment and parental focus on children's development might be part of the story. I'll end with one other thing that's been going on, and that is segregation has increased over this time period. By this, I mean segregation by income. So Kendra Bischoff and I looked at census data from 1970 through 2008, and we classified all the neighborhoods in the country, well, I think this is just for metropolitan areas, as either sort of affluent, high income, high middle income, low middle low, or poor. And then we said how many families live in these different types of neighborhoods. In 1970, about 2/3 of families lived in the two kind of middle income neighborhoods, and about 16%, I think, lived in those two extreme neighborhoods combined. Now it's about 41% live in these middle-income neighborhoods instead of 2/3, and about 1/3 of all families live in these extreme kind of neighborhoods. So we've got increasingly, it's not just, being rich doesn't just mean your family has a lot of money, it means your neighbors have a lot of money too. Being poor, likewise, increasingly means not just does your family have little money, but it means your neighbors have little money. And so if we think that some of what matters for kids' cognitive development is driven by kind of neighborhood conditions or the availability of institutions in the neighborhood or high quality childcare or preschool or health clinics or whatnot, then those things have sort of become more concentrated. So it's sort of in some ways worse to be poor and better to be rich now, not just because of the amount of money you have, but because of the context in which you're likely to grow up given that income. So for all of these reasons, it suggests that it's not just that income inequality matters, but it's that income is increasingly associated with different kinds of behavior, different kinds of environments, and different kinds of parenting that might be sort of what's leading to this growth in this income achievement inequality. So I think I'm going to end there, so we might have a few minutes for questions, because I might have gone longer than I promised. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sean. That was just fascinating. I'll open up for questions from the audience.
Stunned into silence.
Considering that the aim towards decreasing gaps seemed primarily aimed at racial in the past. And I think with the evidence that you showed today, it is not going to be driven by racial anymore, or racial differences. It's actually going to be driven by something that's accelerating, not leveling off or decelerating. So for the people in this room who hope to eventually tackle these types of gaps, what do you think that this implies with the general sort of momentum of the American economy, et cetera?
Well, I think two things. One is we shouldn't ignore racial gaps because they're by no means zero yet. If they were zero, I'd say we could declare victory and move on, but they're not. But certainly the income gaps are sort of been going the wrong direction and raise a lot of concern. So we ought to sort of focus on both, I think. The focus on income disparities, and to some extent the evidence that racial gaps are declining when kids get to school suggests a promising area to think about where strategies to reduce these would be in early childhood. So not just things like high quality preschool and childcare for kids, particularly for lower income kids, which would certainly help, I think, given the evidence on the effects of high quality preschool, but also, parents are kids' sort of primary teacher for much of their childhood. While preschools have them for some hours a day for 1 or 2 years of their early childhood, parents and family have them for a lot of the time. And so thinking about social policies that support low income and working class families so that they can do a better job parenting, so they're not sort of constantly worried about keeping the lights on and the heat on and food on the table, and what if the car breaks down, I'll lose my job. A better safety net for poor and working class families would, I suspect, help low income families be able to do more of the kind of cognitively stimulating work that seems to be effective. And so while I think high quality preschool is sort of a thing we ought to push because there's lots of evidence of its effectiveness, and it's a thing that's easier in some ways to do than to sort of figure out how to intervene in families, it probably shouldn't be the only thing we do. That said, we shouldn't just sort of give up on the K-12 system, right? There's lots of room for improvement there. And so I think figuring out where the levers are, maybe helping support kids over the summer so they don't have the kind of fallback we see in some of the studies, so that they get the same kind of enrichment activities over the summer, so that the gaps don't start to grow again in the summer. So things like that, I think, could be part of the solution.
Sean, I'm wondering whether the measure of income, is that family income or is it father income? Because you go back to the 40s. And what I'm thinking about, and I wonder if you think about this at all, where your trends for income really start taking off in the period of the 70s into the 80s, is really when, to be middle class, you basically need 2 incomes, and increasingly so.
Yeah.
And maybe that's not true at the 90% level, I don't know. But do you think at all about women entering the workforce and that effect?
Yeah.
So, I don't have an answer to it, but I'm wondering if you think about that. But anyway, for measurement, was that family income?
It's family income.
It's
family, not father's income.
Yeah.
Of course, in the early period, it tends to be mostly father's income, and later it tends to be both. But we have looked a little bit, and Sarah McClanahan has looked in more detail at this, as well as there's another paper on this by Greg Duncan that looks at family structure, number of kids, single parent versus 2-parent families, and tries to see if those things explain these trends. And neither of them find any real evidence that those are driving this.
The number of kids was another one I was thinking about.
Yeah, so the number of kids has actually been declining for low-income families faster than it has for high-income families. So that trend has actually been towards increasing parity. So it would work sort of against this in some ways. The single parenthood has been increasing, but it doesn't seem, when you look at sort of micro data, it doesn't seem to have any sort of explanatory legs in explaining this kind of trend. Steve?
So do you Do you know about if you were to move beyond the U.S. to other countries, how does our picture of the pulling away of the top 10% look compared to other countries, both in terms of overall picture and also the relationship between income inequality and educational inequality?
So I can partly answer that. I thought I had the slide in here, but I apparently took it out in some fit of pique. But we looked at PISA data and Pearl's data for a set of 19 OECD countries for which we could get family income information and kids' test scores, and we looked at the size of this income achievement gap measured the same way across those 19 countries and compared it to the US. And the US is at the very high end of those gaps. In the Scandinavian countries, the gaps are about half as big between the highest and low income families as they are in the US. There's one or two countries, I'm forgetting who they are, maybe Germany, maybe somewhere else, that have gaps sort of on the same order of magnitude as the US, but the US's gap, at least in the 19 countries we could look at, is at the big end. What we don't have from those countries is trend data. Most other countries don't have the kind of long history of doing these kinds of national studies where you can look at these gaps over the long haul. One of my former students, Kate Chmielewski, has looked to some extent with some of the earlier, like TIMS and SIMS and FIMS, these kind of earlier international studies, and tried to do some rough comparison of these things. And it's pretty noisy, but it looks like these gaps have been going up in other countries as well, but it's not a very precise estimate, so it's a little hard to say. So it's, in general, we don't really know if this is happening in other countries to the extent it is in the U.S., but certainly cross-sectionally it's bigger in the U.S. now than it is in most other developed countries.
Okay, we'll have two more questions and then we'll break for the reception. So, Stephanie?
Hi. So I was just wondering, we know that race and class are heavily confounded. So I'm just wondering if you looked at your results in terms of interacting race and class,
Yeah.
and how do these achievement gaps sort of fall out once you look at that interaction?
Yeah, so I don't have those slides here either, but we did make those same figures just for whites and just for blacks to sort of see what's the income gap among whites, what's the income gap among blacks. And they look the same. That is, the white picture, if you just focus on whites, you get basically the same trend. If you look at girls and boys separately, you get the same trend. For blacks, you see that the gap between higher income and lower income blacks has also widened over this time. So it doesn't seem, you would actually think that the declining race gap should work against the rising income gap, right, in some ways. They go in the opposite direction. So the income gap growth can't really be because of race, because race gap's going the other way. Certainly, part of the reason why black scores are lower than white students is because of economic differences, but the trends aren't really confounded by race. They look the same if you just look at one race at a time.
Yeah, so I guess the one thing that troubles me when I see a lot of studies like this is that we seem to equate income or wealth with happiness and success. And I just wonder if we had looked at, I don't know what they would be, other measures of what makes someone successful or happy. You know, can we come up with a happiness index?
Yeah. Well, I thought you were going to say we equate test scores with success, which I think is which is more what I was guilty of here, maybe, than equating income with success. Because, but it is troubling. I'll answer by just basically agreeing with you in that I think it's troubling that so much of the national rhetoric about how we measure the success of anything has become dominated by the idea that if it leads to better labor market outcomes, more income essentially, or higher employment rates, then we close the books and we say it's a good thing, without sort of thinking about the other ways in which we would like people to be productive, engaged, happy members of a democratic society, right? I mean, what you really want is everyone to be an engaged, participatory member of a vibrant democracy, you know, in which there was a free exchange of ideas and everyone was happy. Should
Well,
I
with
end on that?
Happy, please join us for reception outside. Thanks. That was outstanding. Thank you.
Thank you.